Greetings
Professor
to,
Sir.
yes, greetings to everyone. Thank you, Professor Kumar, for joining us today. We know it's a very odd hour in the United States, and you have taken out the time to speak to us, so we are very grateful for that. And thanks to all those Professor Pati and other students who have joined us for this reading workshop on Professor Kumar's chapter on Gandhi's Harijan, the apotheosis of inequality. We hope that we can have a great session today. And if I may just invite Professor, just to give a formal note of introduction, Professor Kumar is a professorial fellow at the Stanford University. He's written a book, Radical Equality, which explores Ambedkarian thinking and puts it in an intellectual debate with other streams of thinking on equality. And we hope to further our understanding as students of constitutional law of the other dimensions of equality through this session, and hope to learn about reading the texts of political philosophy and intellectual history better through this session. So thank you so much, sir, for joining us.
Thank you, Brian. Is my audio clear? Can you guys hear me?
Yes, it's very clear.
Okay, great. Okay, I just wanted to thank you for having me. It's wonderful talking to students of law, especially in India. So thank you, and I look forward to this.
Thank you so much, Professor. So the way we planned it is that we would have a few minutes of introduction of the chapter by Kanishka and I, and then we'll follow it up with a long, detailed discussion on various questions that a lot of people would have, and by like Professor's own arguments about it. Before I do that, Professor Pati, would you like to say something before we start?
Not really. I think you guys should carry the mantle. It should be a student's platform. I would like you all to participate and ask as many questions and raise as many discussion points. So nothing really. I'm just here to listen.
Thank you so much, ma'am. So Kanishka, should we start?
Sure, Pranav.
Yes. So this chapter is the fourth chapter in the book on radical equality, and it explores the debate around the naming and framing of the issue of the Harijan as it was being evolved in the contestations around the rights of various communities in the colonial era. It touches upon how the various democratic debates around equality, as well as the status of religion in public life, affected the resolution of this issue. And the chapter gives us a great historical account of how Gandhi's own thoughts evolved from when he formulated the idea of Satyagraha and Hind Swaraj. And then in 1930s, he came to the idea of Harijan and how it was at the core of his account of the nationalism, wherein the social question was not divorced from the political question. Just to give a snapshot, Harijan means literally the child of God, and it was a name that Gandhi gave to the former untouchables, whom he sought to emancipate through his social policies and through his social reform agenda. And he said that this would in a way alleviate their status in the society. So what we see in the chapter is that in this bringing of the social/religious question at the center of politics, the Gandhi is going away from the norm that the political reformers and political scientists have followed, which is to deal with social reform as a side agenda, not the main agenda. And for him, it's the core of the idea of Satyagraha. He's also, and one of the parts of this is that because you are going to deify the individual whom you seek to emancipate, you also remove the idea of human suffering and limitness that subject would be facing. And in that account, Professor Kumar book chapter shows how it is in a very conflicting relationship with the idea of the common humanity of all. And we hope to ask him further questions, but Kanishka has a few points as well.
No, Pranav, I think you summarized the gist of the chapter and like what it entails. To me, just a few points. Like to me, what seemed the most interesting. This idea of the sacred force and Gandhi's relation to like this force, because I had read Professor Kumar's interview with the Caravan some time back, and he also like with respect to Ambedkar, he used this notion of force when it came to Ambedkar's idea of radical equality. And here he similarly mentions Gandhi and his thinking of force in the context of Hinduism and the colonial state. Now, I would really ask Professor to elaborate on that particular notion. And another point with respect to the reading, how the he explains the idea of satyagrahic norms and related ideas. So from I would say I'm not very well acquainted with the social sciences in that aspect. So I would really like Professor to elaborate on those few points, because to me that seems to be the crux of what Gandhi discusses. So yeah.
Well, thank you both thank you, Pran, thank you, Kanishka, for this remarkably astute set of observations on the chapter. And it's it's a complex set of concepts and moral impasses that Gandhi navigates around the question of the naming. And one of the things we see throughout his entire philosophical trajectory is how much emphasis he places on words, on both the emancipatory power of words, of what they can achieve by way of transformative potential, but also actualization of transformative life. And then the violence of words, the hurt that they can cause, the damage they can do on the already vulnerable and the already exposed. And it is between as Pranav was saying, sacrifice has to be understood as his way of resolving an impasse between the finitude and the mortality of ordinary life, and the capacity that every ordinary life has to transcend its own finitude. Right? So there are these two elements of the human condition, so to speak, or human existence, in fact. One that is rooted in our common finitude, our relationship to death, and the other that compels us to transcend this inevitable death through our action. And Gandhi is trying to navigate this through his mobilization and therefore active deployment of a power that he believes words carry, that he believes names carry, right? Throughout, and one of the things I do in the book is try to understand why Ambedkar believes that is an incomplete project, right? Why he believes that naming in itself is a way of lawmaking. Why he believes that the name itself is a compression and condensation of laws. Therefore, the third chapter, as you will all recall in the book, is called Force of Law and Laws of Force, as Ambedkar calls it, right? So there is force, and now I'll quickly jump over to Kanishka's question before others can come in. The question of force comes from this, shall we say, enigma of trying to understand the transformative potential of political action in face of our limits, right? In the chapter, I call this section where I discussed it at some length, a transcendentalism of limits. Right? How do we transcend limits by politicizing limits? How do we change the world without an ascetic withdrawal from the world? Right? For Ambedkar, force is this category that, or let's say, using a very common word, force is an attribute that only the weakest have. only the most destitute, the most derelict, the most neglected, the poorest have this capacity to change the world, right? Now, force is equivocal, like courage. If you've read Hannah Arendt, you will remember that very important sentence in her book on revolution, where she says, courage is a very slippery virtue, right? People who storm Capitol buildings also display some amount of courage, right? The people who stormed the American Congress Capitol building on January 6th displayed courage. And yet for Ambedkar, that is not courage, because courage and force belong in the true sense to only those who are the most neglected, right? In some ways, as I call it in my more recent work, neglect itself has laws. There's a jurisprudence of neglect. Right? We often think of neglect as a passive dereliction of duty, as bureaucratic inaction, as governmental inertia, as Agamben would say, letting die. As opposed to that tradition of thinking, Ambedkar says neglect is an active, positive jurisprudence. There is a law that runs quietly, silently, surreptitiously within the logic of governmentality that allows us, ourselves, to be negligent towards those who are closest to us. Right? That is what he's trying to rescue, the ability to govern constitutionally, the ability to govern ourselves constitutionally must be kept separate from that ability turning into domination and mastery. Force is this ability to govern. Power is its lapse into dominance and mastery, right? Force changes hands very quickly, and therefore that is the most equivocal and therefore the most political of all attributes and virtues we have. So in a sense, force is the organizing principle precisely because of its equivocalness, precisely because it is very difficult to fully grasp its power, precisely because it can be corrupted so easily, right? There is a reason, therefore, as I say in the book, why terms like Raj Dharma or Maryada Dharma are so endemic in their use and abuse in Indian theories of government. But we shall hopefully come to that as we go.
Thanks for the answer, sir. I have another question, which is about the notion of a lawmaking myth. You touched upon it in your answer, but in a chapter you say that the idea of the Harijan is in a way a lawmaking myth that is inscribing the norm of inequality and reminding the unequal about their station or status in life. But it would be great to understand it in a better way. What is a lawmaking myth, and why exactly is this naming unequal and not like relatively equal?
Right. That's a great question. I think that goes to the heart of Gandhi's problems and his own doubts about this. And Gandhi, as we know, is a very firm believer in doubt, in epistemic doubt. He doubts himself throughout. So there's always that power in the way he treats these matters. Now, the problem is not that Gandhi is lacking in doubt. The problem is he is formed by certain ideas that he remains, let's say, dogmatically attached to. Even when he responds in the most malleable and the most, he's willing to convert his ideas, but he's unwilling to change his practical reasoning and practical ways in which those ideas are politicized, right? So there is a sort of discrepancy in how he responds conceptually or philosophically or morally to pressures from someone like Ambedkar. And we know, for example, that one of the great absences in Hind Swaraj, which he writes in 1909, is that of the untouchable. There is no figure of the Harijan or the outcast in Hind Swaraj. By the time he launches the Khilafat and non-cooperation movement a decade later, and even more in the 1920s, as he starts writing about the Gita, his own commentaries and translations, he turns extensively towards the problem of caste. And so much of it has to do with the radicality of Ambedkar's theses that begin to take shape in this period. And Ambedkar himself, a lot has been said, for example, in common literature about how Ambedkar becomes a constitutionalist, how Ambedkar poses and reposes his faith in government, and then eventually, becomes disillusioned with government and converts. I mean, those are the kind of nationalist tranquilization. Those are the kinds of pacification of Ambedkar's radicality that we must be very, very wary of. Because his revolutionary universalism is not tempered, it only grows over time. It reaches its crescendo in annihilation of caste, as we know. But from there on, it's not a moment it's not a fleeting moment that then eventually capsizes or fizzles out into some sort of constitutional belief. He was always a constitutionalist, but as Kanishka was reminding us, as I say, he was a constitutionalist only because he was a revolutionary. Right? There's a whole tradition in which he places himself, in which the truly revolutionary act is that of making a constitution, because a constitution is the embodied document of our collective will to found something, to establish something that did not exist before. And he says in 1950, this was so controversial that it made to the front pages of Times of India and other newspapers. He says, if it doesn't work, we should burn it, right? And so connect this to what he does in the Mahad Satyagraha of the 1920s, right? So there's a very rigorous continuity of this thinking of politics, in which force is that which allows us to resist the charms and the enamors of power. Right? Force is not that which power uses. Force is that with which we resist power, with which we resist mastery. Right? Now, in Gandhi's, to come to more directly to your question, with Gandhi, we have an exactly opposite problem. He's trying to think of a conversion that proceeds on a time frame given by the majority, right? Think of the Gandhi of Hind Swaraj, who says very explicitly, and we sometimes tend to lose the audacity of that formulation in Hind Swaraj, where he says, history is proof that the greatest reforms have often been led by the minority in opposition to the majority. The majority will never convert itself. It's the minority that compels social or political transformation. But by the time we come to the 20s and the 30s, I think that audacity, that courage is somewhere tempered by a whole set of political and moral constraints. But I've argued, as you know, that this compromise, this moral recession, is built into the very logic of Satyagraha. Right? What conceals this logic is a myth for Ambedkar, and this is the myth making of Indian jurisprudence. What conceals our recession into reaction, what conceals or masks or even hides, Ambedkar would say, our counter-revolutionary urges, is this myth that we are a civilizational people, that our commitment is first and foremost to universal hospitality, that we are raised on not just the idiom and the commitment, but on an ethos of nonviolence. the greatest myth-making law, the greatest myth of law, and the greatest mythic law for Ambedkar is this violent non-violence. Our violence becomes non-violent. This conversion is the greatest myth that India lives by. And this is what in reality he is cautioning against in that famous Constituent Assembly speech of November 1949, when he says, this is not a moment of triumphalism because the Constitution will not save us unless we save the Constitution. And that is the contradiction that we must face fearlessly today. Rather than basking in our constitutional glory, perhaps it is now more imperative than ever that we ask what lies and what is it that our myth, our mythic nonviolence conceals. After all, it's a fact that even Nathuram Godse, in the opening lines of his confession, Why I Killed Mahatma Gandhi, actually writes that he hates untouchability, right? Even an assassin in India can actually claim to despise untouchability. So that's a very low bar for humanity, right? Ambedkar's problem is not that we can create norms against untouchability, right? Of course, we can declare our laws and norms to be fundamentally opposed to such a criminal and barbaric practice. His problem is not that. His problem is that the law itself, the very notion of the law in India, is tied and entangled with the sacred, with the untouchable. Hence, Harijan is the name that Gandhi chooses not coincidentally, but symptomatically. It's a symptom that Gandhi would choose God's child for the most untouchables, for the most untouchable in the Indian law. Because this is not a law against untouchability, it is the making untouchable of India's sacred law itself. That's the myth, right? And that is where our pervasive sense of obedience, dharma, comes from. Why entire societies, and this Ambedkar shares with people like radical liberal Juridical, professor of government at Harvard until the 90s, actually. The youngest of the three I put in a triangle, Juridical, Hannah Arendt, and Ambedkar. He shares with this constellation of thinkers. James Baldwin is the other one, who comes from literature, and we all know who he is. The inventor, as I call it in my new work, the inventor of the term American panic. America's panic is that its lie will be called out someday, right? So Ambedkar is in that constellation of thinkers who actually ask a very basic question we should all be asking. How do entire societies succumb to this voluntary servitude? What is the myth that drives this subservience, this logic of obedience? And therein lies the question of the law, of obedience to the law. Wherever, and you all of you at law school know this, wherever there's a question of the sacred, the untouchable, and the obedient, there is the question of the law.
Those are some very good thoughts on what you have explained in your chapter as disciplining force of the law and what this tyrannical discipline of embedded norms is. But I think we'll ask Sarthak what he wants to speak, and we can continue the conversation. Sarthak?
Yes, so Professor, I just had a slightly cynical thought that connects Hannah Arendt and this characterization of Gandhi and Ambedkar that you have also mentioned. Along the lines of the banality of violence and evil that Hannah Arendt sort of speaks of. Now, that banality is what makes like Gandhi palatable as well. His simplistic euphemisms, Satyagraha, Harijan, are so palatable that Gandhi has that force of like the vox populi. And to that extent, you also mentioned how Ambedkar was also mellowed down going forward. His revolutionary instinct was sort of put in the shadow of his constitutionalism. So, while you have mentioned how this constitutional discipline is something that informs how we move forward as a society, as a civilization, my sort of cynical point is that this tempering of the revolutionary instinct is an exercise of this banality itself, in that things need to remain more themselves, and any sort of deviation therefrom has to be very slow and very it has to be informed by the norm, by the status quo. And insofar as it is too out there, it needs to be curved back. Hence the sort of tempering of Ambedkar, hence the mass appeal of Gandhi.
Right. Thanks, Sarthak. I would just moderate a little bit of what you were saying. I was saying exactly the opposite. In fact, I was saying, and this is just a factual clarification. I'll come to the answer in a minute. I was saying that we should be wary of those narratives that see in Ambedkar a certain kind of willful tempering of his revolutionary instinct. You are absolutely right to pinpoint that tempering itself is a form of banality. And I don't think you're being cynical at all. I think it's an observation that is very realistic about of what Ambedkar calls the logic of the Indian political, right? And we know that he reads German thinkers, but I have not found evidence that he was reading Carl Schmitt at this point. He was reading a whole host of European thinkers, we know that. But the expression Indian political should give us pause. That said, Ambedkar's point is exactly, as you were saying, mounted against the idea of slow reform, right? Think of that remarkably brilliant, underrated sentence in Annihilation of Caste. He says, "Enough idle clatter of liberals and liberalism," right? He makes it even more inflammatory in his 1943 essay on Gandhi, Ranade, and Jinnah, right? He says that one of the problems with political faith in India is that martyrdom is now attached to the simple act of going into a prison, right? He says nationalism has swallowed the idea of political faith by conflating martyrdom with imprisonment, right? And this in a moment, if time gives us permission to return to the question of sacrifice, we will come to a slightly earlier moment when Gandhi refuses to intervene in the hanging of Bhagat Singh during the Punjab trials. But let's keep that for a moment aside. I will say this about your question, that Arendt is very clear about the banality of evil thesis. We know, for example, I'm sure almost all of us know that Eichmann in Jerusalem lost her a lot of Jewish friends because they read her as saying that the Jews were responsible for the Holocaust, for Auschwitz. That in the end, Adolf Eichmann and Nazi officers like him were not as responsible. They were just rule followers, which is her exact point. Although she did not care to mend friends, there are two moments in that controversy we should remember. One, in a letter that she writes to Gershom Scholem, the Jewish philosopher. One of the things she says is that I've come to believe, and this I hope, because we are doing this on radical equality, should illuminate something about why I call this equality radical. In that letter, Arendt tells Scholem that I've come to believe that only good can be radical. Evil can never be radical. Evil is rootless, right? There's nothing that it eradicates because it itself has no ground. It is just a depthless abyss of human barbarity, right? Compare this to what Ambedkar has said 50 years earlier in his graduate school seminar about caste. He says, it's like a weed on the surface of a pond it just hangs there without support, with no gravity, no ground. It just hangs there. Right? That is how much of evil caste compresses in itself. But it tells a story otherwise. Unlike racism, unlike apartheid, whose manifestations are visible, unlike segregation, whose instruments are palpable and apparent, like barbed wire, as he says in Annihilation of Caste. Caste is a cognitive form of enslavement. Right? And no good will ever come out of a worldview which says, let's wait for the majority to change its mind. You will remember the judicial verdict on women entering temples in South India, right? It's now permitted, and yet the leading liberal voices will say, no, if the majority says our feelings are still offended, why not wait? And this is the suspension of the law is the greatest mythic law by which a society agrees to live, right? The exception as the norm. Even when the highest court of the land will have said, you must restore internet to an entire state whose map and constitutional status you have erased, the government can just refuse. It just doesn't restore the internet, right? That suspension of the law in the name of the law, that is what is the jurisprudence of absolute disregard. And there is something very, very active about it. We sometimes think that disregard or abandonment or disposability of life are passive activities, right? Ambedkar says, no, there is a decision, there's a will involved in neglect. He calls it very famously, as you know, armed neutrality. We are armed to keep. There is a gurgling appetite for violence in a society that claims to be neutral and non-violent. And that's that's the juridical logic of caste, right? Caste is banal in the Arendtian sense, precisely because it hides in plain sight, and nothing good will ever come of it. And when you say that, Sarthak, you're not being, when you say that, this tempering of revolutionary change or transformation is itself a new sort of pacification, you're not being cynical at all, actually. That is our contemporary history, unfortunately. And that is what Ambedkar warns against in the late 40s and early 50s.
Thank you so much, Professor.
Ganesh? I think Mr. Rajshekharan wants to say something.
I'm sorry, I lost connection there for a little bit. Yeah, so Rajshekharan, sir.
Good morning, Professor. It's actually a wonderful book, but it's a tough read as well. I've not been able to cross chapter 1, so I'm not finding time to continue.
Sorry about that.
I finished chapter 1, but not the other chapters. But one thing, surely you would also noticed the word Harijan. Maybe the word Harijan he took it from Narsingh Mehta, but the idea is not new. Even Ramanuja used the word Tirukulathar to refer to untouchables in South India. And this particular time, when we're talking about late 20s and 30s, there were movements in South India where the untouchables are called as Adi Dravida, which is a much more secular term than the word Harijan. In fact, this movement went to North India as Adidar movement and other movements. And there were also movements in West Bengal where people were termed as Namasudra. So this idea is not new, but I think perhaps even I'm also with you on this. where we'll have to reconcile Ambedkar and Gandhi. And your idea is also different from Nagaraj, which I thought was force-fitting. So to that extent, maybe when I finish this book, I'll have a different idea. But perhaps, I think, Gandhi had another interest also, in addition to the interest that we are talking of. Like, because until, the 30s, many of the courts were still not considering, Dalits as Hindus, untouchables. There were moments here in Tamil Nadu where Hindu colleges were not admitting Harijan students because they were not deemed to be Hindus. So there are many case laws also on that. So don't you think, Gandhi would have thought by naming, the formerly untouchable class as Harijan, is forcefully bringing them into the Hindu fold?
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is a very complex question, and I'm glad you raised it. I will not be able to do full justice to the scope of what you just asked. But let me say this quickly to the last point you make. Absolutely. I mean, there is no doubt that Gandhi's overall moral project is clouded and perhaps even compromised by his religious one. And some have actually called this a salutary part of Gandhi's politics. I'm not so sure about that verdict around his religiosity and how separate it can be kept from some of the political ramifications of his religious practices, especially around celibacy and sexual appetite and so on. So there's a very, as we know, there's a very active literature around that. But there is this much to be said to your question. Gandhi's view is, he's a critic of conversion too. He believes that people should never convert. Yes. Right. So there's a whole history there of Gandhi's inability to break through his own dilemmas or belief systems, let's say, for the lack of a better term. It's a comprehensive and very compromising inability he displays. This is not to say that he does not at certain points display genuine audacity in trying to break through the logic that he's faced with. When he writes about untouchability, one of the primary examples he takes is that of his own mother, when at certain times in the day she would be rendered untouchable. And he uses this as an example. Then he uses the examples drawn from the Indian epic traditions, right? Like Sita going through the fire and so on, all of which are mired in a kind of timeless misogyny, a kind of condescension of human finitude and suffering that he never recovers from, really. His thought never recovers from that. Now, again, we have to understand that he's trying to create a universalism around what he calls Sanatan Dharma. Right? Already that name is so problematic. Right? If dharma is timeless, can it be really dharma? Because it has to respond to specific constraints and specific questions of the moment. Now, he's trying to bring or let's say resolve India's fundamental social question, which he sees as India's punishment to its outcast. The fundamental social question for Gandhi is not the caste system, but its punitive system. So he says, if we were to devise a system of punishment that was more equal, more egalitarian, less driven by untouchability, we would be a better society. Right? He never goes to the point where Ambedkar goes, where he says that the society is defined by its will to punish. It's not that the society can ever transform its punitive system. its punitive reasons, Dand Vivek as it's called in the Indian tradition. It will never change its punitive reason because it is organized around the very will to punish, right? And that is why he believes that that project in which Hinduism will exist without untouchability is simply not possible, right? You can banish untouchability from the law, but the logic of that jurisprudence is itself drenched in the blood of those who are not even visible to the law. The persistence of manual scavenging in India, where thousands sometimes die in a year under our roads in the dark, or as Ambedkar calls it, the dungeon, is not an accidental savagery. It is a mechanical practice of social barbarism that a universalism simply put cannot eradicate. So Gandhi tries that and he fails.
If I may ask one more question, which is that your discourse and your chapter makes us alive to this very strong contrast between what we see in the Indian founding as that of a modern egalitarian republic with a modern law, and what is the law of that republic, and the law that is embedded, the law that is the norm, and the law that prevents the norms from changing, which I think is at the level where Gandhi's actions were there. But what we see in the formal law of the modern egalitarian republic remains exactly that. It remains formal. So we have laws against manual scavenging, which what they end up doing is, if you produce a dead body, they will start penalizing. But there's no other mechanism that works. Or if you look at the laws on untouchability in India, the very notion of or idea of humiliation is so hard and illegible to articulate to the investigative mechanisms, and that has because I mean, what I was trying to think is that maybe this embedded law is frustrating the purpose of the modern egalitarian law. And how does one think about this contestation, or whether if there is any contestation in the first place, whether maybe it's the modern egalitarian law which is on the surface and ultimately it's only trying to perpetuate the embedded unequal law that is at the level where Gandhi was engaging with it.
Right. No, so there are two things here, Pran. Thank you for that question. There is no doubt that Gandhi is engaging with it not at the level of the constitutional or the judicial. He's trying to engage with this question at the level of the moral, right? And one of the things I tried doing from the very beginning in Radical Equality, and even before that in the 2010 essay I wrote, where I first developed the idea of touchability, right, as opposed to untouchability, is precisely this notion that that he's struggling with a world in which legality and barbarity coexist, right? And as Ambedkar tells him, they don't just coexist neutrally, innocently. Barbarity and self-determination will intensify each other over time if their relationship is not fundamentally explored and broken, right? There's only that much that a nation can celebrate about its independence from colonial rule if it has not actually turned inward and started to see how its obsession with civilizational idioms of nonviolence conceal its innate acceptance of barbaric norms, right? Freedom and barbarity intensify each other. And that's something that Gandhi and many others in the nationalist period, so to speak, owe Ambedkar. they owe Ambedkar, and they and the way he shows them and holds the mirror to them compels them to write obituaries that are absolutely unthinkable in a civilized society. Right? In his first speech in the Indian Parliament, Nehru describes Ambedkar right after his death as someone who was reactive. Now, reaction is the last thing you will associate with Ambedkar, right? But that is the framework in which the nationalist mind is trapped, right? C. Rajgopalachari writes in his semi-obituary, anti-obituary, I should say, of Ambedkar, that this was a restless soul who will find peace perhaps in death, right? You see the kind of vehemence against the outcast that Ambedkar had always diagnosed was the hidden, surreptitious, soulless form of the Indian political, the framework of the Indian political, right? If this has to be countered, let alone and highlighted, it must be done on the moral landscape of a society, not a nation, but a society, its social and political and moral constituents, right? And Gandhi does that. But the question that Gandhi never takes, and this is why Ambedkar remains ineluctable for us today. We cannot think without him, I think, is because he is aware that any moral annihilation or moral eradication must proceed in a world that does not presume that the law will back it, that there is a law that will justify abolitionism. There has never been a law of abolition, for example, right? It's only when an abolitionist has succeeded that there is a law against untouchability or slavery, right? Now, I'll give you an example. I was thinking of when Paran, you were speaking, something that has engaged me over the last 18 months or so. The US Supreme Court in June of 21, just last month, upheld a series of voting restrictions placed in the state of Arizona against black voters, essentially Black and Latino voters. The court said, and there are several laws and ongoing efforts to legislate elections in several states that are predominantly held, where power is held by the Republican Party here, in Georgia and so on, which also prohibits you from giving water to voters while they are standing in line to vote. America is already crippled by the lack of a federal independent election commission. Already the states have disproportionate power over elections. And now they're fighting all sorts of federal oversight. The US Supreme Court, in which the conservatives hold a majority, as you know, of 6-3, passed and upheld the Arizona restrictive voting laws. We can go into judgment, and you are students of law, so this is entirely your playground. But I'll say this about that judgment. The Supreme Court said that while it is true that new restrictions passed on voting by the state legislature in Arizona will cause inconvenience to certain voters of color, it does not prove that there is racial intent behind those laws. And because there is no racial intent, the court has a constitutional obligation almost to uphold the laws. It is true that it will cause inconvenience, but we cannot prove racial intent, right? This is what Ambedkar is doing when he reads Jefferson. In fact, he quotes Jefferson in the Constituent Assembly. How do you prove the intent of untouchability when the practice is precisely to not touch someone, to not do something? How do you prove intent when intent is to not do what is intended? It's a double negative untouchability. Not only is the negation of life involved, not only is there a negation of someone's finitude, mortality, let alone breathing involved, there is a negation of my own intent to not touch that intouchable. How will you legislate on that double negative? What is that jurisprudence that or the tradition of positive law that will allow you to say, look, when you're arbitrating or judging such a case, look, there was an intent to practice untouchability. I didn't touch anyone, so where is the question of a manifest intent? This is why for Ambedkar, untouchability is the exemplary form of violence from which every single act of violence in the world learns something from. Because of this double negation of life. In one stroke, that is not manifest, right? So untouchability is exemplary because it becomes visible to the law in its very abolition. It's incumbent upon the revolutionary abolitionist to bring untouchability into the realm of the juridical and the legislative and the constitutional. Because no theory or no legal principle of intent will ever prove the existence of this barbarity. Now, that is what we are faced with when we speak of untouchability. And for Ambedkar, it has to be a moral, psychological. First, acceptance. The first principle of annihilation of caste is that the abolitionist is speaking the truth, that he comes from a place of truth. He comes before the law, as it were, because that is the only way you can fight the law before all laws. That unspoken mythic law that compels us to not touch someone and yet not make it visible. Right? Much of Gandhi's moral compulsions and critiques of untouchability are derived from some of these insights in Ambedkar.
That's very interesting, Professor. In fact, that was my precise question to you. Politics of touchability, I think, that you describe in your book with respect to Gandhi, because I found that particular part to be really interesting in how it manifested into his, political dimensions, at least, especially in the whole idea of satyagraha, and then consequently his idea of a state and the relations of the constituents of a state. So, that for me, like your your expression of the whole idea was very interesting. And I had a small question with respect to, when you said in the obituaries of Ambedkar, there were certain statements made. There was this fascination with this spiritual that we see in the masses. And that's very manifestly present in Gandhi's, elaboration of satyagraha and then consequently its relation to the state. Ambedkar's relationship with religion to that extent, does it qualify to the same level it did with Gandhi? Of course, it's not it's very different in the way both of them use it. But how exactly would you say Ambedkar related religion, state, and emancipation, if you may?
Yeah, that is. You are all familiar. I will say this, Sarkar. I mean, you're all familiar with Ashish Nandi's work. Very influential. Back of the 1980s, still has a surprising hold over people. And I'm really, every time I think about it, I'm kind of surprised how much power and influence that that idea of Gandhi as a philosophical anarchist has come to be. In no measure, if you read, there are two things that radical equality tries to do. One, as you said, is deconstruct the Gandhian idea of the state, which sometimes he will not even call a state. He clubs and compresses a series of practices under different notions of obedience and limits and disciplines and maryada and Shudra dharma and Kshatriya dharma, as we know, right? So, but the underlying logic is always tied to his affinity for sovereign power, right? And so the way in which his own jurisprudence works is very closely aligned to the to almost the spiritual idea of the modern state, right? The modern spirit is a very modern category in that sense. It has a very, the most powerful articulation of spirit is a spirit of the state in Hegel, right? Now, once you have moved past that notion of the state, once you have tried to unpack, once you have
Sorry about that. Soma, can you mute yourself?
Oh shit.
It's all right, totally.
Sorry about
it's another Saturday morning. It's all right. Ambedkar is someone who is extremely aware of what the discourse around the spiritual can lead to. It can lead firstly to a subservience to an unquestioned and unseen power, which is just sovereignty by another name, right? It's not that he believes that his struggle or the struggle for emancipation in India or anywhere is ever less than a spiritual struggle. But as you were saying rightly, that notion of the spiritual battle, or what he calls the struggle, is rooted not in notions of law and sovereignty, not in notions of maryada and limit. They're rooted in notions of what he would call maitri and faith. In fact, he calls it faith in equality. That's the term he uses. Faith in equality is attached to another expression in his work, which he calls the right to justice. Right? There is no right that will give you justice before you establish this norm that the first right is justice itself. Right? His religiosity, if that were a word, he never uses that term in English. And as we know, later in his life, he stops translating a few of these words. Increasingly, for example, in the 50s, he will stop translating words like maitri. He lets them be because he does not think that the notion of friendship fully captures the radicality of that Buddhist articulation. Right? How do you articulate a politics? And Pranav was mentioning that problem of articulation too. How do you articulate a politics that takes this faith seriously without being deterred by that which it must destroy, which is a politics that speaks in the name of and like religion, right? Annihilation of caste, think of that, section 21. To not destroy such a religion which lies to you is an irreligious act. The first religious responsibility is the critique of religion. And here he is almost telegraphically engaging with Marx on the Jewish question. Right? The first and last critique is the critique of religion. Right? So his religiosity is negative. It is negative because it must be critiqued. Because in India, the majority is not a political majority, it is a communal majority, end quote. I'm quoting him here. right? It's a communal majority. Communal because it is at once anonymous and sacrificial. That is, when it launches itself into its collective delirium, it will sacrifice anything, including itself. There's a suicidal dimension to the Indian majority that undercuts even the logic of modern self-interest. If you remember the 2000, the second elections that brought Narendra Modi to power in 2018, there was an interesting statistic that showed that the BJP actually made gains in parts of countries where the BJP had invested absolutely nothing by way of infrastructure, by way of roads or basic drinking water, and so on, right? So even that logic of interest upon which the modern social contract rests is undercut by this communal sacrificial logic. How do you articulate a religiosity in this world, in such a world? And this religiosity will, he thinks, will be articulated only through one faith, and that is our faith in equality. And that is why this is radical equality. Because it is an equality, it is a faith in equality that takes religion for not for what it makes possible, but for what it conceals. Right? So when we say Ambedkar's relationship to religion, we have to be wary about both these ways of thinking that we have inherited, fortunately and unfortunately. One that sees in his conversion some awareness, some return to the spiritual because he's lost his faith in the state, right? This is going back to Sarthak's question. He's very acutely aware that, there is no, one must be very acutely aware that that narrative is a narrative of pacification of Ambedkar's radicality. He's not disillusioned. He always believed in faith, in a political faith, right? But he also believed that, India will never be able to secularize itself, no matter what it claims, or no matter what its liberals claim.
It's brilliant, sir. Really enjoyed this.
Thank you. I'm glad it's helping because it's a difficult book, as you've said. So,
yeah. I have one question, which is that the name of Harijan was soon after the independence in 1970s. There was a lot of struggle against this name itself, and it was abandoned by official decree. Obviously, people continue to breach the norm and use it, but there has been a. Am I audible?
Yeah.
Yes, you are.
Yeah. So what do you see in these struggles against undignified nomenclature? Like, how do you see these as maybe assertions of equality? Are these assertions of the constitutional formal law, or perhaps this is a counter this is an assertion of the counter values that Ambedkar tried with in terms of his relationship with religion that you expanded upon? Because when we talk about Harijan, we also think about what could be a better way and what could be a better nomenclature. And while there is Dalit, there is the depressed classes, then there is exterior classes. How does one productively think about this question of nomenclature in a context where the formal law does not dictate social morality? Social morality would need its own idea of a counter ethics to be dictated by. So yeah, it's just a fuzzy question about that.
Mm-hmm. No, that's and Ambedkar struggles with this question. There's no doubt about that. And I don't go into this in detail, but I do mention quite early in the book that the word Dalit becomes germane and then eventually central only after him, right? His use is very reserved. He uses several constitutional categories to describe untouchables, depressed classes, and so on. The problem I think he has with our compulsions and impulses to name something, to give something names, comes from our compulsion to both mark out our injuries and separate those who are injured by that act of naming, right? He's fascinated. It's not an angry rage that he displays towards these acts of naming. He's very thoughtful when he writes, and he takes almost a decade to really develop his thoughts on this matter. Gandhi does this in 1931. His longest set of reflections on the name and the act of naming come in 1945 in what Congress and Gandhi have done to the Untouchables. 14 years there, right? And in Annihilation of Caste, he doesn't take this question up at all. It doesn't bother him, right? What really troubles him in any act of naming is the motivation. What is it that motivates us to give names, or as we will say in English today, call someone names? Why should the subject itself not name itself, right? This happens every time a debate around LGBT rights appears, right? Like, who are the heteronormative people to call names or give names? Let them choose, right? So there is an inherent, intrinsic, and let's say irreducible inequality in the very act of naming. Think of that inequality as the act of naming that a parent engages in when a child is born. We're all part of that inequality, right? We're all part of that inequality, except when that name can break open the mythic logic of the law, right? Ambedkar's teacher trying to give him his surname, for example. There was that one, right? Now, so the breach he tries to make in this question, Pranav, is not whether we can ever find an appropriate name for something, right? He's trying to displace a politics of naming itself, right? And he quotes Shakespeare in a way from Hindus that essay he's quoting Shakespeare on rose and red and all that, right? He's trying to make these points colloquially in different ways, trying to say you can name something, give something names, but it's irreducible vulnerability with which it is born and which we are responsible for inflicting on it every single day will not change by a simple act of naming. Quite to the contrary, you are enabling the apotheosis of the unequal qua unequal as an unequal, rather than giving it the status of God. You are entrenching its inequality by consecrating and therefore making untouchable that unequal. That's the double there again, right? Now it's like God's child. Don't question, don't touch, right? It's a particular form, as he says, of political idolatry. Right? The politics of naming is drenched in a politics of idolatry. And the question, therefore, for us is not how to name someone. The question is how to create a politics that does not depend on name calling, which is what you write in your essay on Divyang. Same logic of consecration occurs there, right? We try and wash our hands of our collective indifference by making the untouchable untouchable. Right? That's the paradox of our politics. That which is born untouchable is now rendered even more untouchable by being rendered sacred. Hence the chapter Apotheosis of the Unequal.
Actually, I would like to add a point here, sir. While I spoke about the naming of Adi Dravida, it was an entirely, Dalits agency here in Tamil Nadu. From 1860 onwards, we started using the word Dravida, to differentiate, what was current there, Aryans and Dravidian philosophy. Then when the other intermediate castes started calling themselves Dravida, then, from 1880 onwards, people, Dalits started calling themselves Adi Dravida, which were much more ancient than Dravidans and the original inhabitants. In fact, we have a law from 1920 where Dalits in Tamil Nadu are called Adi Dravidas. Actually, there are many caste club to it. This is a government terminology also. But the fact remains, even then, in everyone, all the intermediate castes, the Hindu caste Hindus, still use the word depressed classes. In fact, the equivalence in Tamil is more disparaging. They call Thalthapattai. The emphasis is you are actually, much more depressed than the rest of the society. They don't use the word Adi Dravida, or they don't use the word Dalits. So recently, there's been a movement here in Tamil Nadu where, we have been fighting, saying that you shouldn't be using the word Thalthapattai or depressed classes to denote Dalits, Adi Dravida. So this naming, there's a psychological, thing also attached to it. When someone names you and, what is the name that he is interested in calling you?
Yeah, and there is a very, we all know that there is a whole global debate around who can use certain addresses and names for certain groups and communities, right? It's just because a community calls itself something does not give others the right to call them that. Right? In the United States, using certain words for African Americans is outlawed and considered hate speech, formally and informally. If you use words that are permissible within those communities of color, and the same holds for different groups and communities in different parts of the world. This is true even of Europe. So what is important here, and the word that you mentioned is crucial here. What is crucial here is agency, right? What is crucial here is not intent, right? You cannot have, and this is what Ambedkar is telling people like Gandhi, you can't have both. You can't have a good intent when you name me or you name call someone, and yet you will say that intent can be proven in the court of law because it's not manifest. You can't have both sides of the coin. On the one hand, you want to claim good intent. On the other hand, you want to prove in a court of law that there was no intent. Right? That is the what's the word that's the aporia in Greek. Aporia, you translate it in English, it's placelessness, something without place. That's the aporia of law. It hangs in this abyss where it can neither prove intent and nor can it bar it because it can't prove it. So there it is, hangs like that. The law of naming is that, and Ambedkar is trying to critique that logic of naming. Its agency is undeniable, but an upper caste person can't claim to have a good intent. Intent is not agency. Self-naming could be agency, but someone else naming is law. And it's not a very good law.
I think Divya wants to say something.
Yeah, actually, the women from the oppressed community, the most marginalized, that is, of a of an abyss of variant from various peripheries. Women have from a marginalized and oppressed community has been oppressed, and it's still been oppressed. So while even when we compare it to the Brahminical patriarchy, women from the oppressor community, that is the upper caste, also been oppressed with this the practices of manusmritis. Still, it's in practice. So it's seriously confusing. When can a woman? Whenever I mention women, it's not seriously from a cisgender community. So when can a woman can come to a political dom? That this is a serious big question mark.
Yeah.
So need a clarity on that.
Yeah. Divya, that's to all the women in our audience and this session, I say only this, which I often say, that there is no greater act of toxicity than misogyny. The hatred of the woman is the first primal hatred, right? And this is why, which is why Ambedkar drafts the Hindu Code Bill. And eventually he's forced to resign because the conservative factions of the Congress party and even Nehru's cabinet would not let it come to pass, would not present it on the floor of the on the parliament. So, the short answer to your question is that oppression is not just one law. It is a web of laws. Oppression is an apparatus of laws, right? And they go very deep into our system, and they go very deep into our psyche. That's why Ambedkar describes his own method as archaeology. In the late 40s, he calls himself an archaeologist. In fact, he calls himself in the same way a paleontologist. He says, my work is like the work of that paleontologist who's found remnants of ancient extinct bones. And I have to piece them together like a paleontologist. And I have to create a fuller human being out of those remnants of broken bones. And what he's really saying is that the depth of oppression is bottomless. And in most cases, oppression acquires a social form through laws of obligation, not responsibility, but obligation. And the first obligation, the first human obligation was the obligation of woman to man. Every system of oppression has gender written into it, right? There will be no annihilation of caste without annihilation of patriarchy. It's very simple. The logic is as simple as his analysis is dazzling. You start reading Ambedkar and you realize the breathtaking integrity, by which I mean continuity, in which he unpacks and deconstructs this nexus, this apparatus of oppression. You can't be a free man as long as there is an unfree woman. It's that simple. Because the first oppression is the oppression of our misogyny, of our collective hatred of women, right? And they will empower women to train their own guns on women too. This is why the VHP and the RSS are so successful. They use that resentment to turn women suicidally against women. So the Durga Vahini, I mean, these days, the Durga Vahini of the 1980s and the 1990s looks benign to us, given how lawless and fanatical Hindutva vigilantism has become. Right? Women are armed, young men are given country-made guns to just shoot at random, while the police becomes yet another bystander, and the courts become another machines of acquittals. 80-year-old dissenters refused oxygen, refused glasses to read, refused books in prisons. It is a politics of vengeance that is inseparable from the politics of misogyny. Even when the victims are men, as Ambedkar says, the first obligation was the obligation of the woman to man. Try fighting that and see how vicious its sword is, right? Think of honor killings here. You cannot think of the logic of the honor killing without caste honor. Without, as he calls it, the logic of endogamy. You take away endogamy, you take away caste, right? Which is why Ambedkar is baffled by Gandhi's insistence on interdining or temple entry. In the 1930s, he says, I don't need to enter temples. I need women to be able to marry anyone they love. I want men to be able, Muslim men to be able to marry anyone they love, right? The real problem is not that some people are barred from temple entry, because he was prophetic. Even if you legally allow temple entry, there would be no transformation. Liberals will be the first, as they often are, to say, look, we should care about majorities' sentiments. So what if the court has allowed women to enter temples, right? There is the running logic of misogyny is the bedrock of caste oppression. And to underestimate the power of that misogyny is to underestimate the power of caste itself, which is why he tries to pass the Hindu Code Bill. How many of us here quickly are aware of Hannah Arendt's last interview? A woman thinker in a man's profession. Are you so? This is directly to what we can do, and this is. I will take the example of a woman thinker, Divya, in response to your question. Arendt is asked how it feels to be a political philosopher, and she says, "I'm not sure they consider me to be a political philosopher. It's a profession of men. I'm a woman, and I'm therefore I'm a political theorist."
The rhetoric truth.
Right. I'm a political theorist, and I'm interested not in the rights of man. Right? Because that is where it begins, with the rights of man. I'm interested in the plurality of men and the rights of men, sure, but I'm not interested in rights of man. And that critique is important. That critique of masculinity is important.
Thanks for this. You have opened up this pathological religious rhetoric. It's not only religious rhetoric oppressions over women, but women are themselves are insisted to point the gun over the other. That is, we need to break that point. Like each woman have to understand the peripheries of misogyny or peripheries of oppression that have been carried out or sorted out over her body organs or on her sexual organs have been targeted, be it for for a multiplication of people of a society, of a caste, or the women is targeted. For killing a community, the women is targeted. So each woman, not necessarily, I'm stressing this often, that is, when I speak women, it's not only from the cisgender. So every woman have to participate in educating this, to unlearn and relearn the politics. Thank you.
So if nobody has any questions, do we have any more reflections, questions? So would you like to say something more? We would like to...
Please.
Yes, no, sir. If there's anything else to share from your chapter, which we can learn from, and any more resources that we should definitely study to understand the relationship between the philosophy of equality in the Indian context, we'd love that, and we'll continue reading more. In addition to that, I know we are over time, but Kanishka and I had a small matter to also bring up, and we just wanted to seek your reflections on it. But we could do that after you give your concluding thoughts.
By way of resource, I would only say, I mean, you know, we all study law and come to it from different perspectives. So all I will say is read carefully and read widely. Right? This is, if there is a lesson in Ambedkar, it's his ability to cut through the constraints and the laws of his own context. And so that is one of my favorite moments in this documentary, which I often talk about on Derrida. There's a documentary on the French philosopher Jacques Derrida, where the camera is following him around his apartment, and he takes the filmmaker to his study. And you know, there are books and they're falling off the shelves, and the camera pans and looks around, and then she turns to Derrida and asks him, Professor, have you read all these books? And he says, no, only 4 or 5 of them. But those 4 or 5 very, very carefully. And I think that's a very important thing to remember. The things you read carefully. There are laws of reading, right? And you have to break through those laws and disciplines of reading in order to really read. As James Baldwin writes in his essay, Black English, not 1,000 years ago, it was criminal for a slave to read. Let us not forget that it is a hard-fought right. And they will take away the right to read if we don't defend it. So that would be my only observation around reading and resources.
So would you have 5?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, there's a slight lag from my end. But I just want to say that that's a very powerful point that you put forward, Professor, because I believe in NLS also, like, we espouse similar, values within like our small reading circle. Like, that's the reason why, this talk for us was really profound. So yeah, thank you so much for that.
Thank you
yeah,
for having.
In fact, sir, Kanishka leads this discussion group every week, wherein he brings up one reading of Ambedkar, and people, like most of us, are expected to have come read it. But even if we don't, then he summarizes all the points. We all have a very live discussion on it. So that's an attempt that we are trying to do to fill up our deficiencies. And if you have just 2-3 minutes, we'd like your reflection on something. So
right.
what Kanishka and I have been talking about.
Sure. No, sorry. Yeah, so as like we have been speaking about this fascination with the spiritual of, and the idea of Maryada and of Dharma pervading, legal like scenario in India for centuries, since the time, since before Gandhi even, for that matter. It still continues, even in our institutions. We had the a conversation on this. How the motto of our own law school is still Dharma Rakshati Rakshitah, which is like the protection of Dharma as a as an idea.
Yeah.
So to me that, yeah. Please go ahead. You're saying?
No, I'm listening. That's a great point you raised. Go ahead, please. Finish it.
Right. To me that seems, almost like I can't conceive it. I can't imagine it that, even after all these discussions, even after all these critiques have come about, like these established critiques have come about, this, fascination with the spiritual and it translating into, the norms of the social, like still it doesn't end. So just wanted to, put that forward for your consideration.
Yeah. No,
and if I may add,
go ahead, Prof. Go ahead.
So we also see like this fascination with Manu in the sphere of law. We see people calling Ambedkar the modern Manu, as if it's a matter of honor. So I mean, we were just concerned that that idea, you said that constitutional idea itself is evolutionary, but isn't the pervasion of the spiritual in the legal sphere a counter-evolutionary act itself when we look at it in terms of how it is shaping values? Because the very literal meaning of Dharma Rakshati Rakshate is that those who protect the social order shall be protected. So it's a conditional protection, which is very different from the Article 14 of equal protection of laws to everyone. So, I mean, these were just the thoughts, and we thought it would be good to seek your reflections before we conclude the session.
Yeah. No, that's, you've hit on the very heart of the matter and of the law. When we say dharma, let's unpack this very quickly, if you will. The question of dharma is different from the question of, I would say, the question of a just law. Right? Law and justice have a very aporetic, very problematic, and yet very, very inseparable relationship. Justice always exceeds, it must exceed the law, because justice is something that always transcends the limits and boundaries set in place by law. And yet in the world, justice can come only through mechanisms and verdicts of the law. So that is the aporia we were saying of the relationship between law and justice. Right? Now, this law, this relationship between law and justice is distinct from the notion that we have in mind when we use the word dharma. Right? Now, there are two ways to understand that. One classical way of understanding dharma is a whole catalog of obligations, duties, anecdotal advisories, statutes, and so on, right? Which somehow allow us to develop a system for a moral conduct of life. The problem in such an innocuous and innocent reading of dharma is that it conceals by design the punitive logic of dharma itself. Right? If you take away punishment from dharma, what becomes of it is that which Ambedkar would eventually call dhamma. The Pali, plebeian, democratic responsibility. He never used, I mean, it's fascinating that in the whole tradition of our thinking of law in India, nobody actually asks this question. And this is what I would say, even as a parting remark to you all. there's a need, and you should ask this question. You should ask questions like these when you work at the intersection of politics, law, and government, because that is what law is, a system of government. There is no non-political abstract law which people who espouse dharma like Maryada Dharma or Raj Dharma claim to, claim their or profess their commitment to, right? Raj Dharma became, imprinted on our collective psyche when Atal Bihari Vajpayee is supposed to have told, even in that video clip that is now everywhere, is supposed to have told Narendra Modi as the Chief Minister of Gujarat, I want him to follow his Raj Dharma. Which is fascinating because it gives a very liberal view of Atal Bihari Vajpayee, a comparatively liberal, sane, statesman-like view of Atal Bihari Vajpayee. And on the other hand, you have someone like Narendra Modi. You ask him about the pogrom, as he was asked repeatedly during the 2014 elections about Raj Dharma, which is interesting because this word keeps coming back in our collective vocabulary and discourse. And he says that, will you, if you're driving a car and a dog comes right in front of your car and dies, would you blame the driver? Right? That's the rootlessness of this violence, right? And this from a view of the world, which is Hindutva, which is more than a view of the world, which will kill human beings in the name of animals, right? Which will kill human beings because it loves the cow. This from a movement that professes its fidelity to an epic in which a hero, Yudhishthir, would not enter the heaven if his dog was not. A dog follows the disenchanted Pandavas up to the gates of heaven, right? There is a way in which dharma becomes a device to manage these contradictions. Right? Dharma is not innocuous obligation. Dharma is a management of our moral contradictions. It's an alibi for our refusal to question ourselves. That's what Ambedkar would call the life of contradiction that we have entered. Right? So it is important, and I say this to students everywhere, and so many of my own students who are at law school, that law is categorical. You practice law, you study law not because you simply get to justice through law, but because you get to question legal categories. That's the first task of law, to question itself. Why? Because there is law to everything. There's a law of reading, for example, right? There's a law of, let's not forget, touching and not touching. The first law. A law, as Ambedkar says, without gravity. It just hangs there. So it is you who study law who must pluck it out of there and question it. That law is fundamental to a politics of justice. Dharma is not law. It's an apparatus to manage our moral contradictions. The Indian epic tradition, which Ambedkar reads like nobody else, in the depth that nobody else does. The Indian epics are populated with heroes who melt away in self-despair, in self-doubt, in self-sacrifice. It's all about the self, except one. They have no self-contempt. They have no self-reflexive idea of their own evil. There's every form of self-aggrandizement in the Indian epic tradition, in the dharmic tradition. There is Arjun's self-doubt. There is Bhishma's self-despair. There is Gandhari, there is Dhritarashtra, there is Ram Rajya. There is Sita with Maryada. But there is no self-contempt. The feeling that must saturate us after we fail in our dharma itself. No, instead, dharma gives you a way out of it. Right? That's how it manages contradictions. To study law is to study that contradiction. It is to not accept the law. It is to question its categories. And that will make you a better lawyer. Because what else is there to the practice of law?
Thank you so much. Those are very good thoughts, and we hope we can continue to become better lawyers by raising these important questions, and have your support and guidance in that in the enterprise. Just as a formal conclusion, may I ask Professor Pati to deliver a vote of thanks? And
thank you, Professor Kumar, for sparing what is probably, I think, your Friday evening to this conversation for the students.
That's great.
And thank you for such an erudite lecture and conversation around the question of law, politics, religion, and bringing it into a philosophical discourse which unworks the assumptions of all of these, right? So, and thank you for all the students who stayed back for, I think, at least the majority of the discussion. I think several of you have dropped out now. And thanks, Achal, Pranav, and of course, Kanishka for carrying this out and actually carrying this out on your shoulders and making this possible, right? Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Pati, for having me, and to all three of you who have been in touch and helped organize this. This is the most exciting use of my Friday evening and midnight, by the way, which in this part of the world they say get a life. So I'm really delighted to be with you all on Friday, and I'm sure you all have had better things to do on Saturday morning. So have a great weekend. Thank you for having me. Thank you, Professor Pati. You're very kind. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.
Professor.